they thought Barron Trump was just another privileged kid. Then he tore apart their entire legal argument. The courtroom in Los Angeles, California, was packed. Rows of legal experts, journalists, and onlookers filled the gallery, waiting for what many assumed would be a routine hearing. Cameras clicked. Pens scratched against notepads. A low murmur buzzed through the crowd as they anticipated a moment that, in their minds, would be little more than a formality. At the center of it all sat Judge Ronald Beckett, a man known for his sharp wit and an intolerance for what he saw as theatrics in his courtroom. His reputation was built on no-nonsense rulings and an openly cynical view of high-profile figures who thought they could bend the law in their favor. And today, he had Barron Trump standing before him. The judge leaned back in his chair, tapping his gavel against the desk with deliberate slowness. His eyes studied the young man, barely 18, standing across from him in a tailored suit that looked just a little too crisp, a little too perfect, like he was playing dress-up. Beckett sighed, adjusting his glasses. "Mr. Trump," he began, his tone dry, almost amused. "I have to say, this is a first for me. An 18-year-old standing before me expecting to argue a case. Now, I understand your last name opens doors, but the courtroom isn't one of them." A ripple of laughter moved through the spectators. Even some of the attorneys smirked, exchanging knowing glances. But Barron, he didn't react. He stood still, hands folded in front of him, eyes locked on the judges. No fidgeting, no awkward shuffling, no nervous glances toward his counsel. Just silent, unwavering attention. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Nothing to say? No speech prepared? I expected at least a half-hearted attempt at proving why you belong here." More chuckles from the gallery. Someone muttered, "He's out of his league." Finally, Barron spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but it was steady. "I wasn't aware the purpose of this court was entertainment, Your Honor." The laughter died instantly. A few heads turned. Eyebrows raised. The judge's smirk flickered, barely noticeable, but it was there. "Well," Beckett mused, flipping through the case file in front of him. "Let's hope you can back up that confidence with something other than your last name." The tension in the room shifted. It was subtle, but it was there. The expectation had been simple: Barron Trump would stand here, stumble through legal jargon, embarrass himself, and serve as a lesson that wealth didn't equal competence. But now, something was different. The judge's amusement hadn't vanished completely, but it was tempered by something else. Curiosity. Still, curiosity wasn't enough to change his mind. Not yet. He adjusted his glasses again and gave a dismissive wave. "All right then. Let's hear it. Show me what you've got." But no one in that room, not the attorneys, not the judge, not even those watching from home, was ready for what happened next. Barron stepped forward, unshaken by the judge's dismissive tone. He placed a neatly organized set of documents on the podium, carefully flipping open a legal brief as if he'd done it 100 times before. The judge watched with mild amusement, clearly expecting hesitation, nervous stammering, something to affirm his belief that this was just a rich kid playing lawyer. Instead, Barron adjusted the microphone and spoke clearly. "Your Honor, before we proceed, I'd like to clarify a few legal misinterpretations that have already been presented in this case." A pause. The room, which had been filled with whispered conversations and scribbling journalists, suddenly quieted. Barron continued, his voice steady. "The opposing counsel has repeatedly cited Harper v. Sullivan as a precedent for dismissing key testimony in this case. However, that ruling was made on the basis of improperly obtained evidence under an unconstitutional search, circumstances which do not apply here. It's irrelevant." There was a flicker of movement on the other side of the courtroom. The lead attorney from the opposing counsel, a seasoned litigator in his 50s, shifted in his seat and quickly scanned his notes. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" Barron nodded, flipping a page in his brief. "Yes, Your Honor. In fact, if we're discussing admissibility, Foster versus Crane would be the more appropriate precedent, given that it directly addresses testimonial credibility under conditions of indirect coercion, something far more relevant to the argument being made today. A low murmur spread through the courtroom. Some of the legal experts sitting in the gallery exchanged looks. This wasn't rehearsed bravado. This wasn't just throwing around legal terms to sound impressive. This was precision. Judge Beckett leaned forward slightly, studying Barron with a new level of interest. The smirk he'd worn earlier, gone. But the opposing attorney wasn't ready to let an 18-year-old rattle him. He stood, adjusting his tie. "Your Honor, with all due respect, we're not here for a law school debate." "The argument remains that?" Barron didn't let him finish. "If you're dismissing precedent because it's inconvenient, that speaks to the weakness of your case, not mine." The courtroom fell into stunned silence. The opposing attorney hesitated for a fraction of a second, and in that brief moment, the balance in the room shifted. Judge Beckett turned to the attorney. "Would you like to respond to that?" A long pause. Then, through clenched teeth, "I'll address it in my argument, Your Honor." It was a retreat, plain and simple. The judge knew it. The attorneys knew it. The journalists definitely knew it. And Barron? He simply adjusted his papers, waiting for what came next. Judge Beckett tapped his pen on his desk. For the first time, he didn't sound condescending. "Continue, Mr. Trump." But now, it wasn't just about continuing. It was about proving that first moment wasn't a fluke. Judge Beckett had seen his fair share of self-assured litigators, seasoned professionals who walked into his courtroom thinking they could outmaneuver him with confidence alone. But an 18-year-old? That was new. He shifted in his chair, watching Barron carefully. The usual arrogance he expected from someone with his last name wasn't there. No smugness. No over-explaining. Just direct, precise arguments, delivered without hesitation. The opposing attorney took a deep breath, flipping through his notes with a forced calm. He needed to regain control. "Your Honor, while Mr. Trump's reference to Foster v. Crane is impressive, it doesn't hold weight in this context. That case was about testimonial coercion, not the chain of evidence." Barron didn't miss a beat. "Actually, counsel is mistaken. The ruling in Foster didn't just address coercion. It specifically reinforced that testimony remains admissible if the primary conditions of influence do not exist." He lifted a page from his documents, holding it up for emphasis. "Which is exactly why the witness in our case remains legally protected." The judge's eyebrows lifted a fraction. He glanced at the opposing attorney, waiting for a response. But there wasn't one. A ripple of murmurs passed through the gallery. One of the reporters up front furiously typed on his laptop, while a legal analyst leaned over to whisper something to her colleague. Barron continued. "The idea that testimony should be discarded simply because it presents an inconvenience to the opposing side is not just legally incorrect, it's dangerous. If we start applying precedent selectively, we undermine the foundation of due process." The room was silent. Then, the judge let out a breath. It wasn't quite a sigh, not quite a chuckle, just a sound of realization. He sat back in his chair and folded his hands. "Well, Mr. Trump, I have to admit, I wasn't expecting that." A small shift in the room. Some of the attorneys exchanged knowing glances. This was no longer the judge testing an inexperienced kid. Barron had his full attention now. But the opposing counsel wasn't ready to surrender. He stepped forward again, voice sharper. "Your Honor, we're getting sidetracked here. We're still dealing with..." Barron, calm as ever, tilted his head. "If the law is inconvenient for your argument, that's not my fault." A single chuckle escaped from the gallery before someone quickly stifled it. The opposing attorney clenched his jaw, flipping through his notes again, searching for a counterpoint. But the damage was done. he had already been forced onto the defensive. Judge Beckett exhaled through his nose, expression unreadable. "All right, Mr. Trump. Keep going." But now, everyone in that courtroom was waiting for Barron's next move. And no one, not even the judge, was prepared for what he had in store. The courtroom wasn't just watching Barron Trump anymore. They were studying him. The murmurs had stopped. The pens had slowed. And even the most skeptical faces now showed something else: intrigue. Judge Beckett leaned forward slightly, fingers laced together as he studied the young man standing before him. "All right, Mr. Trump," he said, his tone more measured than before. "Since you seem so well prepared, tell me, what exactly do you believe is the fundamental issue with the opposition's argument?" Barron flipped to another page in his notes. No hesitation. No unnecessary theatrics. "They are basing their entire claim on a misapplication of Keating v. Burlington," he said, matter-of-factly. A murmur rippled through the attorneys seated behind the opposing counsel. The lead attorney stiffened. "That case has been cited in multiple courtrooms as precedent for dismissing evidence under procedural errors." Barron nodded once. "Correct. But if you actually read the decision, rather than cherry-picking citations, you'd remember that the ruling specified those procedural errors must directly impact the reliability of the evidence. In this case, that standard hasn't been met. You're not arguing law, you're using it as a shield." Judge Beckett blinked for a moment. He just sat there, taking in what had just been said. The opposing attorney's jaw tensed, his face reddening slightly as he flipped through his own notes. Barron, still composed, continued. "If this court were to entertain that argument, it would create a dangerous loophole, one where procedural technicalities outweigh substantive justice. That's not how precedent works, and I'm sure the court is aware of that." Silence. The opposing attorney inhaled sharply, closing his folder as though he realized he'd lost this particular exchange. Judge Beckett drummed his fingers on the bench, nodding slowly. "That's an interesting perspective." He exhaled through his nose, pausing before speaking again. "So, Mr. Trump, let me ask you, if we apply your interpretation, what do you believe the court should do next?" The entire room held its breath. Barron didn't miss a beat. He placed his hands on the podium and met the judge's gaze head-on. "Rule in favor of the testimony's admissibility. Anything less would be a deviation from the established legal framework." The judge studied him, his expression unreadable. For the first time, Barron had done more than defend his position. He had taken control of the conversation. But there was still one final moment that would leave the courtroom in stunned silence. The opposing attorney opened his mouth as if to counter, but nothing came out. He glanced down at his notes, flipping a page, then another. There was nothing there that could refute what had just been said. Judge Beckett let the silence stretch. The weight of the moment was settling over the room like a heavy curtain. Even the journalists, some of whom had arrived expecting a different story entirely, weren't scribbling anymore. They were just watching. Finally, the judge cleared his throat. "Mr. Trump, do you realize what you've just done?" Barron met his gaze, his expression as steady as it had been since the beginning. "I presented the only legally consistent conclusion, Your Honor." Judge Beckett exhaled through his nose, a sound that wasn't quite amusement but wasn't dismissal either. He turned toward the opposing counsel. "Counselor, do you have anything to say in response?" The attorney stood rigid, his jaw locked. He knew the truth as well as everyone else in the room. Barron had just ripped apart the foundation of their argument, piece by piece. Any attempt to salvage it would only make them look weaker. After a long pause, the attorney finally spoke. "No further objections, Your Honor." A murmur spread through the gallery. Barron Trump, the 18-year-old they had laughed at just moments ago, had just forced a seasoned legal team into retreat. The judge tapped his gavel twice. "In that case, the testimony remains admissible." And just like that, the tension that had been building all afternoon broke. Some gasps. A few exchanged whispers. And the unmistakable sound of a reporter muttering, "Unbelievable." Barron exhaled slowly, but not in relief. He had known from the start that this was how it would end. Judge Beckett studied him for a long moment. The skepticism from earlier was gone. What replaced it was something different. Respect, perhaps. But also realization. This wasn't just a well-rehearsed performance. This was a young man who had come prepared, who had faced down the condescension of a courtroom that expected him to fail, and left them speechless instead. But the judge wasn't finished yet. Judge Beckett sat back in his chair, tapping his pen against the desk. The courtroom was still. No one dared to speak, waiting for the next move. Finally, he let out a slow breath, eyes never leaving Barron. "Well, Mr. Trump. I must admit, I misjudged you." A few murmurs broke through the silence. But the judge raised a hand, silencing them. His expression was unreadable, but his tone had shifted. The amusement from earlier had disappeared. "I've been on this bench for a long time," he continued, voice steady, "and I've seen a lot of people walk through those doors thinking they could outsmart the law. Most of them fail." The gallery leaned in, waiting. "But you," Beckett said, tapping a finger on the desk. "You didn't rely on theatrics. You didn't stall. You didn't throw around legal jargon just to sound smart. You knew exactly what you were doing." Barron remained composed, but something in his posture shifted, just slightly. He wasn't expecting the compliment. The judge tilted his head. "Tell me something, son. How long have you been studying law?" Barron didn't hesitate. "4 years, Your Honor." Beckett raised an eyebrow. "And yet you're not in law school?" A beat of silence. Then Barron replied with quiet certainty. "Not yet." The judge exhaled sharply through his nose, shaking his head. "I'll tell you this. If I had attorneys in my courtroom with half your level of preparation, I'd probably have an easier job." The opposing counsel sat stiffly, arms crossed, saying nothing. There was no argument left to make. Judge Beckett straightened in his seat and adjusted his glasses. "The testimony remains admissible. That ruling is final." He glanced back at Barron one last time. "And Mr. Trump, consider this your first unofficial law school exam. You passed." The gavel struck. Court adjourned. Barron simply gathered his notes, gave the judge a polite nod, and turned to leave. The journalists, attorneys, and spectators all watched him as he walked out. No longer just the son of a former president, but something else entirely. A force to be reckoned with. The lesson here is simple. Never underestimate someone based on assumptions. Intelligence, preparation, and resilience will always speak louder than a name or a reputation. And remember, real power doesn't come from where you come from. It comes from what you know and how you use it. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more content like this. There's always more to uncover, and you won't want to miss it.